Welcome back. We are continuing with Going Native, written by Uncle Sealing. Going Native, Chapter 5. The river worried Stace. He had been hoping the freeze would stay off long enough for the soldier in his bed to finish healing. A canoe trip upriver with the two aliens would be tough, but it would be the quickest way to get them back to civilization. However, the ice was already starting to form on the still edges, and from upstream small chunks would float past. In a few days it would be incredibly unsafe for his canoe, and not long after that it would be impossible. Stace set up his gillnet and thought about praying for some fish, but he never knew who to pray to, and he was pretty certain it didn't make a difference. He would just hope his net didn't freeze in place before he came back to get it. Walking the short distance back to the cabin, Stace considered his options. He didn't know if he could supplement his larder enough with hunting and fishing for all of them. He had planned on living out of his pantry through the winter, but he hadn't prepped enough for guests. He might need to break out his rifle and look for bigger game. Stace had been bow hunting for the last couple years, trying to preserve his ammo and enjoying the thrill of the chase, but he also hadn't been hurting for food. A mix of farming and fishing kept his stock high, and the hunting was more for variety and added protein. Once he made it into the vestibule, Stace pulled off his coat, then his hat. As soon as his ears were clear, he stopped. He could hear voices in the cabin. Voices. More than one. Stace practically threw himself into the cabin, startling the two aliens. Ian had pulled the stool next to the bed and was talking quietly with the soldier, a cup of water in his hand. The woman was propped up on a couple pillows and gave Stace a look he could not identify as he came up. Scared? Determined? He couldn't tell.
Please tell me you speak English,
he said, trying to keep the hope out of his voice as he came close. As soon as he got in range, the soldier's hand shot forward, grabbing Stace's forearm near the elbow. Despite her obvious fatigue, the grip was painfully strong and only got stronger as she started to speak.
I don't know how you did what you did, but you are not going to get away with killing my soldiers and kidnapping us. By the time the Shilvati are done with you, there won't be anything left. If you release us right now, I might ask them to be lenient, but I swear to the goddess that I will personally destroy you and everyone you love if you don't let us go.
The woman said, her voice starting low but becoming loud and feverish as she continued her rant. Stace tried to interrupt, but he couldn't get a word in as she continued to pour out a stream of words powered by grief and anger. Stace tried to tune her out as the threats continued, but the ache in his arm increased as her vice-like grip tightened. Finally, he had had enough, and he did something he knew he would probably regret later. He poked her. Her howl of pain and the moan following it as she let him go to clutch at her wound should have felt satisfying, but Stace was too frustrated, too stunned by her reaction to take any pleasure in another person's pain. Turning away, he picked up the twisted piece of purple metal from its place on the table, still black in patches from her dried blood. Stace tossed it in her lap, then slammed the door on his way out. Ian stared at the woman in shock. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but it definitely wasn't good.
What did you just say to him?
The soldier stopped staring at the closed door and turned to Ian, her pain-filled grimace turning slowly into a sly smile. She gave his wrist a pat, then started talking.
You don't need to worry, you're safe. These insurgents can be trouble, but they know better than to kill prisoners. He probably just wants a ransom, which of course he won't get, but we don't need to tell him that. Once I put the fear of the goddess into him, he'll let us go.
Ian could feel himself starting to shake from his building rage.
I want to start screaming at you, but that won't help anything.
He spoke quietly through clenched teeth.
Instead, I am going to ask you again. What did you just say to him?
As soon as the woman opened her mouth, Ian raised his hand to interrupt her.
I want you to tell me, as accurately as you can, What you just yelled at the man who saved both our lives and pulled you out of a burning shuttle wreck.
Once she started to talk, he interrupted again.
I want you to be as clear as possible when you explain to me, in detail, why you practically assaulted the man who removed 20 centimeters of shrapnel from your abdomen and stitched your guts back together. And then I want you to pray to the goddess that he doesn't just let us go, because if he kicks us out we will be frozen to death by nightfall. Please. Explain.
The look of dawning horror on the woman's face didn't make up for how angry Ian felt, but it sure helped. The sharp crack of the axe splitting the birch log carried through the trees as Stace worked his way through his angry pile of firewood. He had found in his younger years that the knotty, branched wood that was a pain to split was great for working out some aggression with a wedge and a splitting maul. When Stace had worked his way down the river, choosing his campsite and future home, he didn't have much room in his canoe, but he made sure to throw in the heads for a splitting maul, a sledge, and a few other tools. Over the years he had carved and broken several handles for each tool, but the savings in weight and space meant he was able to be a little better prepared. He had books showing him how to make stone tools in a pinch, but he was hoping to never need to. Even though the purple alien's words had set him off, he wasn't thinking about her. Instead, Stace was back a dozen years, thinking about the funeral and the aftermath. The same sort of shouting and accusations had come out of his mother-in-law's mouth. She had even grabbed his arm the same way as she yelled, accusing Stace of corrupting her son. According to her, Daniel's cancer wasn't from genetics or those damnable cigarettes he smoked or sheer dumb luck, it was divine punishment, a symptom of the evil Stace had inflicted on her son by loving him. In her mind, their relationship had stolen her perfect boy away from her, ignoring the simple truth that Daniel had realized that he didn't need his nasty homophobe of a mom in his life. He had chosen his own family. The woman shouted and threw things and caused such a scene that Stace couldn't deal with the anxiety and, just like today, he left. Of course, that meant later on she could throw abandoning her son's funeral to the list of imagined crimes he had committed, but that was a problem of a different sort. Right now, Stace's mind kept circling back to accusations and blame. He worked on autopilot, stacking and splitting firewood, seeking the calm numbness that he had cultivated over the last few years. Slowly, inch by inch, he was able to push the emotions down and reclaim his tranquility. Stace hadn't done much more than grab his axe on his way out, and though he hadn't grabbed his coat he didn't feel cold at all. In fact, the frozen air felt good on his overheated flesh. His undershirt was damp with sweat and the constant motion kept him feeling warm. Stace felt like he could keep this up for hours. By the time Ian had finished filling the woman in on their situation, her entire attitude had changed from grim determination and bravado to subdued horror. Her name was Ella Helium, and she was the pod captain in charge of the group of soldiers on the shuttle. She was trying to put on a brave face, but Ian was good enough at reading people to know at least some of how she felt.
So this human, us does or whatever, just happened to be nearby.
Her suspicion was plain on her face.
As far as I can tell. I don't know how far away we are from the crash, but I wouldn't expect it to be more than a couple kilometers at the most.
Seems convenient.
For us, definitely. For him, I don't think so.
Ian's smooth face twisted into an uncharacteristic frown.
I don't think he likes people in general. I can't help but feel like we are interrupting something by being here.
Ella let out a quiet hum.
So why is he helping us then? Just afraid of getting into trouble with the Shilvati government if he doesn't give aid. Hoping to get some sort of reward. What's his angle?
Ian flushed a little, a quick memory of how comfortable he felt cuddled up with the human in front of the fire. He had an inkling of what sort of reward Stace might like, but he certainly wasn't going to put that into words.
I think he might just be a good person.
The large woman shifted in the bed slightly, wincing in pain before she shook her head. She clearly either did not notice Iing's reaction or didn't want to say anything.
Everybody has something they want. Probably something the new government can provide him. Now that you have a woman here who can speak the language and take command, I will get him sorted out.
Iing spent a moment obviously staring at the bandages wrapping her abdomen. There were a few new spots of blood from where Stace had given his opinion on that course of action. Elora seemed to deflate slightly as she understood the wordless comment.
I think we should just be open and honest with him. Treat him like you would treat any shilvati.
Listen, I understand. He's been nice to you, he saved both of our lives. I'm not saying he's bad, but he's a human. They resent us for taking over their planet. They all have some sort of agenda. You're new here, but I've been here since the beginning. We took over pretty easily, but they have been fighting us in all sorts of ways since then. My guess. We found one of those humans that was leading the military during the initial occupation. Some of them went into hiding. Maybe he sees us as a way to get a pardon so he can rejoin society or something. We can work with that.
Elora nodded to herself.
It all makes sense. He probably has medical training from being a soldier. This cabin looks pretty old. He probably built it right after we arrived and he had to hide. Didn't have the tits to keep fighting to the end.
Everything she said fit together and made sense, but to Iing it just felt wrong. He could see two different pictures of Stace in his mind's eye. One was some sort of military mastermind, the image that Elora seemed to have made up whole cloth, and the other was the kind man who seemed to be doing his best to keep the two of them alive even to his own detriment. Try as he might, he just couldn't get the two pictures to come together. He would have go get Stace and ask. Elora laid back on the lumpy, uncomfortable bed as Iing made preparations to go outside. It was clear to her that the male civilian was too naive, too trusting. That said, she didn't believe her own theory either, not really. It was important to be confident and set a good example. Elora gave a little wave as Iing pulled on a bulky, oversized coat clearly too large for him and worked through the doors. At least the blast of cold air as he went through lent some credence to his tale. As soon as she was alone, Elora made her move. Rather, she tried to. Her plan had been to ransack the room, find a weapon, and make sure she was ready in case things turned rough. Even if you hope for the best, you need to be prepared for the worst. Instead, Elora started to roll onto her side, preparing to get off the bed, only to have a shooting pain deep in her belly curl her into a ball. Well shit. Rolling onto her back again, she noticed new spots of blood leaking through the bandages. She was being an idiot, and she knew it. She just felt so impotent. Her entire pod was dead and she hadn't even been able to help. Her memory of the crash was hazy. Elora remembered strapping in and chatting with the girls. They were half-jokingly blaming each other for making the cute guy move to the cockpit when the whole ship shuddered and rocked. They strapped in and braced for a crash, but everything after that was a blur. She lost everything in an instant. With a yell of frustration, Elora banged her fists on the bed again and again. She stopped when she felt the bed frame shift alarmingly. Looking down, she noticed a crack in the wood corresponding with the flat spot she had left in the wood from the repeated strikes. The frame, the rough blanket, even Elora's arm was flecked with spots of dark blood. With a sheepish look, she inspected the side of her hand. The cut was superficial, but even a small cut got messy when you stupidly slammed it into a piece of lumber. As she heard the door to the outside slam, Elora sheepishly rearranged the blankets on her lap to cover up the damage.
Stace.
The human was at the side of the cabin, stacking firewood. He seemed to be in a trance, not really focusing on anything. At least he didn't seem angry anymore. After standing still for a moment, Stace turned and seemed to recognize Ieng. He pulled himself together and gave a small smile and a nod. Ieng waved his arm in a beckoning gesture and was somewhat surprised to see Stace obediently following him back into the house. Once they were back inside, Stace took off his dripping shirt, soaked with sweat and melted snow. He flipped it onto the drying rack next to the fire and stood there, eyes closed, warming himself and drying his reddened skin. Ieng glanced over at Ellora, who was staring at the shirtless man with a very non-professional look on her face. "Goddess protect us, this is just what they needed right now." With the two distracted, Ieng moved over to the chest of drawers he was inspecting before. He quietly slid open the second drawer and took a peek. His face flushed dark with embarrassment. Ieng slammed the drawer and opened the next one. Definitely wasn't what he was looking for. The third drawer was a success, though, and Stace turned from the sound of the drawer slamming just in time to get hit in the face with a worn, rough-woven wool shirt. Ellora's quiet.
Ah.
Didn't escape Ieng's notice, and he shot her a quick glare.
Tell him to dry his feet.
Ha.
Ellora looked at Ieng in pure confusion.
What did you say?
Well, since I'm obviously going to have to father the both of you, and I don't speak his language, you need to tell him to warm up and dry his feet. Something's wrong with him, he seems out of it.
Ieng pointed at her.
So talk to him. Maybe you'll be able to figure it out.
Human.
Stace didn't react. He was trying to decide if it was an insult to call him by his species or if the alien honestly didn't know his name.
Stars. You Stace.
He corrected automatically before looking up and locking eyes with the large purple alien. She had the same gold rings floating in ink eyes as Ieng, but on her they seemed harder, more aggressive.
My friends call me Stace.
The alien gave a small, plastic smile, her dark lips framed by two larger, sharper tusks than what the smaller male seemed to have.
Your friend Ieng.
She said, glancing at the Shilvati male glaring at her.
Wanted me to remind you to take care of your feet.
Stace sighed and pulled the chair over to the fire, pulling off his boots and starting to slowly unwind the sweat-soaked bandages his feet were wrapped in.
You can tell him I was going to, and he doesn't have to worry. It's not a big deal. It's healing up just fine.
The two aliens spoke to one another briefly as Stace massaged his feet with his hands a little at a time. Thanks to his clever positioning of the chair, he was pretty sure they couldn't get a good look, and besides, it's not like they were going to be experts on human frostbite. His toes on both feet were red and blistered, with the redness creeping up his right foot from the toes halfway to the ankle. Stace wasn't sure if it would actually heal on its own, but he wasn't holding out much hope for it. After what seemed like a brief argument, the soldier spoke again.
I feel that I should apologize. I misread the situation earlier and I just assumed the worst. I just lost my podmates and I took it out on you, but I am sure you can empathize. After all, our occupation is still fresh in many minds.
No.
Stace didn't even look up as he continued massaging some warmth into his feet.
No.
The woman sounded confused, wrong-footed by a response she clearly hadn't expected.
You don't forgive me.
Stace waved a hand.
Don't worry about that. It just made me think of other things. What I mean by no is that I have no idea what you are talking about.
He could hear the incredulity in her voice.
You don't know about us. The Shilvati. The Empire.
Nope.
Stace gave up on his feet and propped them up by the fire, turning to look across the room at the topless alien.
I am pretty sure I would remember seeing someone like you too.
He gave Ellora an appraising look, taking in her shoulder-length dark hair, her indigo skin, the sharp angular face. Her tusks were larger and more prominent than Ieng's, and speaking of prominent, With everything that had been going on, Stace had seen Ella's body, but he hadn't really looked at it. Now that attitudes seemed to have cooled and the crises were over for now, he could appreciate her muscular torso and large, full breasts. Her dark nipples were tight and prominent in the cold.
You are very distinctive.
As his eyes continued to slide down, he noticed the fresh, dark blood soaking through her bandages. With a sigh, Stace began quickly wrapping his feet back up. There was always more work to be done. End of chapter. If you enjoyed, like, subscribe, and visit the author, and I'll see you next time. If you didn't, comment on what I can do better. And as usual, have a wonderful day.